Several months ago, I wrote a column in which I argued that the oil sands had not brought down emissions in part because they simply weren't deploying technology that they had been developing for years and years. Don't know why they don't want to talk about why they don't do that, why they are rolling out some of these technologies very slowly, and why that has allowed their absolute emissions to increase, even while their emissions intensity per barrel has declined. Well, yesterday, the Pembina Institute released another report about stagnant oil sands emissions. They simply aren't dropping. And so I'm going to talk to Scott MacDougall, who's the senior advisor with Pembina, and he focuses on carbon pricing, oil and gas, and carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So welcome to the interview, Scott.
Thank you, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Look, this is the third year, I think, that you've been doing this update, or you've updated it from 6 months ago. Kind of give us the overview of where we stand with oil sands emissions.
Well, we understand that oil and gas emissions overall are probably recovered from the little dip that they had during the pandemic, and overall, over the last 10 years-ish, oil and gas emissions in Canada have been plateaued. They've been pretty flat, waggled around a little bit, but not really going up or down.
Now, I interviewed Kevin Byrne at S&P Global, who's been working on this. I've been interviewing for years about oil sands emissions, and he says that over the last year, they basically stayed flat, even though production went up just a little bit. They're now at about 81 megatons per year. But Environment Canada says that they're about 83 to 85 megatons, different in measurement methodologies. But doesn't Pembina do its own estimates as well?
Actually, no, we don't. We usually rely on sources like both of those. And we should be getting Climate Change Canada's updated national inventory report numbers later on this fall. So what S&P did is gave us some interim emissions estimates until those NIR numbers are out.
Well, one of the things that Kevin Byrne told me about last year during an interview is that they're expecting that oil sands production will grow by about 350 to 400,000 barrels a day by 2030. And that's actually going to lead to an increase in absolute emissions to about 85 megatons a year, might even hit 90. And furthermore, if the CCUS plans the Pathway Alliance has, if they don't pan out and CCUS is delayed, then those numbers might be even higher. So I don't know, what's Pembina's take on that?
Our take is, based on this latest update in this Waiting to Launch series that we've been running since last year, based on latest quarterly reports, the oil sands companies are really not increasing. There is no new spending on emission reduction projects. And at the same time, it is really notable that they're on track for probably the second highest profits year they have had for this year, 2022 being the highest. So they sure look like they could afford to be investing in emission reduction projects. But instead, we're hearing increasingly from CEOs of companies like BP, Suncor, Shell, that they're actually doubling down on business as usual, on status quo, increase oil production, reduce oil costs. The quote from Suncor CEO Rich Kruger recently, where he thinks that the company has had a disproportionate emphasis on the long-term energy transition. That's just such a sign that there's every reason to believe they may not invest anymore in emission reduction projects unless they get pushed rather hard. We really think that the federal oil and gas emissions cap is going to be critical.
Well, let's talk about Kruger and Suncor, because last year, in their 2022 investor presentation, Suncor promised to reduce its emissions from 29 megatons a year to 19 megatons a year by 2030. They're the only oil sands company that has promised a reduction, and they were going to do it by increasing efficiency in their boilers, particularly at the base camp, where they were going to replace they burned petcoke, which is a horribly emissions intense form of energy. They were going to switch to natural gas. That was going to be a big reduction. They were going to do some other efficiency improvements and a few other things, but they were taking a different approach. And is there any indication under Kruger that Suncor maybe will abandon some or all of those emission reducing initiatives?
I haven't seen any sign of that coke boiler replacement project, which, I mean, full disclosure, I actually worked on. I initiated that project and led it for a couple of years while I was at Suncor. But I haven't seen any signs that they're off track from starting up that project next year. It looks like in their latest investor report that they're still on track for that. As for the other investments, like efficiency improving investments, I'm not too sure. I don't recall seeing signs of those ones.
Now, I want to talk about that because the efficiency improvements that Suncor is making are, yes, they bring down emissions, but they also increase the efficiency with which they use energy in their extraction processes. So they're actually helping their bottom line as well. They're lowering their production costs, which is a major focus of all of the big oil and gas companies in Canada going forward. Okay, so that's a good thing. The problem is that there aren't that many of those kinds of projects. And the companies, and anybody who's interested, you can go to our YouTube channel. And 2-3 months ago, I interviewed Dan Wicklum, who was the first CEO of COSIA, the Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance. And they were supposed to share all this technology. And he said they did that for about 2 years, and then they just quit doing it. And he also said during that interview that he has been told many times by oil sands executives that they will not invest in emissions reducing technology if it is a net negative on their books. So as long as it costs them money, they don't want to do it. If they can invest, if they can spend capital and help improve their free cash flow and their balance sheet, then they'll do it. And that's always struck me as a backwards way of doing things. These are liabilities. Emissions are liabilities. They should pay to lower the emissions, and they don't want to do that. Is that consistent with what you're hearing?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, so it's, for example, like it's more than 2 years after the Pathways Alliance was launched, and there's still no new investments in reducing their emissions. Like oil sands emissions. Profits, like I said, are very, very high, so they can afford to reduce these emissions. And it's true they have to be cost competitive. And as you know, global production declines. I mean, the latest statement from Fatty Birol at the International Energy Agency indicating that like it's still like demand is still going to decline, but for all fossil fuels around 2030. Cost competitiveness is going to be as important as carbon competitiveness, but they're still stuck on a status quo track on the carbon competitiveness. And the cost of not doing enough is enormous for Canadians. Like economic damage done by climate change, it's been estimated could be in the $390 to $870 billion annually by 2100. The oil sands companies have an obligation to do something about this.
Yeah, and we should point out that oil sands emissions all by themselves are 11 to 12% of Canada's national emissions. I mean, these are huge emitters we're talking about. Well, let's talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, because the Pathway Alliance, which is kind of now the new trade association, and carbon CCUS is a big focus for the pathways. And they were saying that it's going to take $75 billion to decarbonize by 2050. They wanted government to pay $50 billion of that, and 2/3 of the decarbonization would be CCUS. I mean, they're essentially putting almost all of their their hopes into CCUS. And where are they at with getting that up and running? Because I think they were supposed to get about 16 megatons a year of reductions by 2030 using CCUS.
Yeah, still not seeing the big investment announcements related to those projects that I think we would need to start to see some serious signs of around now if they're going to hold the 2030 timelines. I mean, things can happen fast. I mean, the companies can certainly step on the gas when they really want to execute those projects in a hurry. So, I mean, the boat's not over the falls yet, but time is getting tight. They've been pushing on the federal government for incentives as well, and I guess there are 2 remaining incentive policies that are outstanding. I mean, one of them is the investment tax credit for CCS. That draft legislation has been out for comment this summer already. So that's looking like it's on a good track. Still needs to be finalized, but things are looking promising because carbon pricing is probably the dominant incentive for CCS. And a lot of folks have expressed some uncertainty. I mean, concerns about uncertainty about that. Carbon contracts for difference is a kind of a policy that's been floated as a way for government to sort of backstop that uncertainty. There's supposed to be some consultation on that this fall, so TBD. That one, yeah, we really do need to make sure that we really need to see the federal government follow through on that one.
Well, let's talk about the emissions cap that is supposedly we're going to see it either this fall or early in 2024. When the federal government launched this discussion paper around the oil and gas emissions cap, there were really only 2 options. One was cap and trade, which would have been on top of the industrial emitters tax. And then there was simply doing away with output-based pricing on the emitters tax, which gives companies like the oil sands a huge discount. I mean, it used to be 80%, and I'm not sure what it is now. It's lower than it was. But when we talk about $65 a ton for a carbon tax, the oil sands companies are not paying $65 a ton. They're paying far, far less. And one of the ways to put a cap on this would simply be to either do away with that discount entirely, so they bear the full cost of the carbon tax, or reduce it in a very timely fashion. And what's your take on how the emission cap might be designed and when we're going to see it?
Yeah, great question. In terms of the timing, I was actually just looking at an article, I think in the Financial Post, where Minister Guilbeault was quoted as saying before COP this year. So that would put the timing of a draft cap as potentially sometime in November. So fingers crossed on that one. I think we really do need to see it in that sort of timeline, and ambitious. In terms of the form of the cap, we've been a bit agnostic about whether it ought to be you can make a strong pricing option or a strong cap and trade option, and I think we're kind of happy both ways. I mean, folks have argued around which one will work better for, is most compatible with, federal powers, and, will stand up better under, federal provincial jurisdiction arguments. I'm no lawyer, so I don't have a dog in that fight, but I understand, that's a concern. Yeah, I think there's lots of options to either, reduce the sort of free allocations that the oil sector gets as a way to put some more pressure on them in either of those options. also to reduce the flexibilities that players have to use, say, different kinds of credits and offsets. And certainly if there are credits and offsets floating around, probably to make sure that those credits come from within the oil and gas sector, or maybe come from emission removals type projects, like potentially carbon dioxide removal, or something that's actually, net removing carbon from the atmosphere. Those probably are, legit ways to do things. But I mean, allowing them to use offsets and credits from outside of the oil and gas sector wouldn't do enough to drive emissions within that sector. So I guess we'd be a bit concerned about that.
Well, Scott, thank you very much for this. We'll keep an eye on what the federal government does with its emissions, oil and gas emissions cap coming up this fall, and we'll have you on to talk about that when that happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Markham.